A black and gold Pontiac Trans Am screaming down a Georgia highway with a truck full of Coors beer, a sheriff who can't let it go, and a man behind the wheel who made the whole thing look effortless. Most people assume that car is sitting in a museum somewhere, rope around it, little placard on the wall, totally safe. It is not. The real story of what happened to the Trans Ams from Smokey and the Bandit is messier, stranger, and honestly more interesting than anything Hollywood would have written for it. And at least one of them ended up exactly where nobody expected. Hi, my name is Johnny, and this is American Muscle, the film and the moment. Let's go back to 1977, because you cannot understand what this car meant without understanding what that year felt like in America. The muscle car era was functionally over. The 1973 oil crisis had already done its damage. Federal emissions regulations had strangled horsepower out of everything Detroit made. The cars that teenagers had worshipped through the late 60s were now shadows of themselves, neutered and apologetic, and the industry knew it. What America had instead of muscle was a weird cultural moment happening in the South, a CB radio craze that had swept the entire country, and a growing appetite for movies where the good guy drove fast, broke rules, and won anyway. Burt Reynolds was the biggest movie star in the world at this point. Not one of the biggest, the biggest. And Hal Needham, his stuntman friend who had never directed a feature film in his life, came to him with a concept so thin you could read a newspaper through it. A guy bets he can run a truckload of Coors beer from Texarkana to Atlanta in 28 hours. That's it. That's the whole movie. Universal passed. They thought it was a nothing project. Needham and Reynolds put it together at Universal's smaller division for a budget of around $4.3 million. They shot it in less than a month. Burt Reynolds improvised half of his best moments. Jackie Gleason did the same on the other side of the camera. Sally Field showed up and made everyone around her better. And the result opened in May of 1977 and became the second highest grossing film of that entire year. Second only to Star Wars. Let that land for a moment. The movie about bootlegging beer across state lines almost beat Star Wars. Almost. I mean, it didn't, but almost. The car had a lot to do with that. The car, what it actually was. Now, let's talk about what the Trans Am actually was, because it's worth understanding why Pontiac was so eager to hand cars over to a low-budget Universal production with no guaranteed return. By 1977, Pontiac was in a complicated place. The GTO was gone, killed by emissions and insurance costs. The muscle car lineup that had defined the brand through the late 60s had been systematically dismantled. What Pontiac had left was the Firebird platform, and within that platform, the Trans Am was their flagship performance statement. The 1977 Trans Am came with a 460 cubic inch V8 under the hood, producing approximately 220 horsepower. Now, I want to be honest with you here, 220 horsepower by 1969 standards is embarrassing. By 1977, emissions strangled standards. It was genuinely the best Pontiac could offer, and the car still moved. 0 to 60 in the mid 7-second range, a top speed in the neighborhood of 120 miles per hour, and a supercharged soundtrack from that engine that did things to the American nervous system that horsepower numbers cannot fully explain. The body was the thing though, the shaker hood scoop, the screaming chicken on the hood, the T-top roof panels, the low aggressive stance. This was a car that looked fast, standing still. Pontiac finished the hero cars in special edition, black with gold accents, a combination that had never existed in quite that configuration before. After the film, it became the definitive Trans Am look. Pontiac essentially let Smokey and the Bandit design their marketing for the next 5 years. The arrangement between Pontiac and the production was straightforward. Pontiac provided cars, the production provided exposure. Nobody wrote a check in either direction. That's how studio fleet deals worked and frankly still work. You scratch my hood, I'll scratch yours, or something like that. How many Trans AMs were actually used? Here is where the mythology starts to separate from the reality. And this is the part of the story that most videos get completely wrong. There was not one Trans Am. There was not even 2 or 3. The production of Smokey and the Bandit used somewhere between 4 and 6 Trans Ams, depending on which production accounts you're reading and how generously you define the word used. The breakdown works roughly like this. There was one primary hero car, the vehicle used for close-up driving sequences, interior work, and anything requiring the camera to actually live with the machine for an extended period. This is the car that Burt Reynolds sat in. This is the car that Sally Field sat in. This is the car that had the most camera time, and consequently the most cultural weight attached to it. Then there were stunt cars built or modified to handle the sequences that would eventually destroy them. High-speed runs, the chases, the close calls with Sheriff Buford T. Justice's various Cadillacs. These cars were built to be used hard, and they were. And then there were additional vehicles kept on standby, because when you are running a production on a shoestring budget in the Georgia heat, and you need the car to be perfect every morning, you need backups. Hal Needham understood this better than almost anyone alive, because he had spent 20 years as a stuntman, watching productions grind to a halt, because the one car they needed was wrapped around a telephone pole. So, the question of what happened to the Trans Am from Smokey and the Bandit is really multiple questions running simultaneously. What happened to the hero car? What happened to the stunt cars? What happened to the backups? And who kept track of any of it? The answer to that last question, for a long time, was nobody. What Pontiac did next. Before we get into where these cars went, let's talk about what the film did to Pontiac, because it is one of the more remarkable accidents in automotive marketing history. And I do mean accident. Nobody at GM planned this. Nobody in a boardroom greenlit a strategy called, "Let Burt Reynolds save our car company." It just happened. Pontiac sold around 68,000 Trans Ams in 1976. The year after Smokey and the Bandit hit theaters, that number jumped to 87,000 units. The year after that, it jumped again. By 1979, Trans Am sales had more than doubled their pre-film baseline. Dealers were marking cars up. Buyers were waiting months for delivery. The special edition black and gold package, the one created specifically for the production, became the single most requested configuration in the entire Pontiac lineup. People were not asking for other colors. They wanted the Bandit car. Exactly the Bandit car. Think about what GM actually spent to make this happen. Nothing. They loaned some cars to a low-budget production, with no guarantee the film would even find an audience, and received in return one of the most effective product placements in the history of American cinema. No ad agency. No media buy. No focus group. Just Burt Reynolds leaning against a black Trans Am with that mustache and that smile, and an entire generation of Americans quietly deciding that was the coolest thing they had ever seen in their lives. Then they drove to their local Pontiac dealer and asked for one in black with the gold package. The dealers could barely keep them on the lot. Here is the part that tends to get lost in the celebration of all those sales numbers. The Trans Am line survived because of this film. That is not a dramatic overstatement for the sake of a good story. That is just what the evidence shows. The market conditions that had already killed the GTO, that had gutted the muscle car lineup across the entire industry, those conditions had not changed by 1977. Emissions regulations were still tightening. Insurance costs were still punishing performance cars. The economic headwinds were real, and they were not going anywhere. Without the cultural moment that Smokey and the Bandit created, the Firebird platform almost certainly does not survive into the early 1980s. The numbers were not there before the film. They were absolutely there after it. Pontiac stumbled into the right decision completely by accident, which is, if we're being honest, exactly how most of the great ones happen. Where the cars went after filming now. Where did the cars go? When principal photography wrapped in 1977, the surviving Trans Ams were dispersed in ways that were completely standard for the era and absolutely catastrophic for preservation. Those two things are not in conflict. It was standard practice. It was also a disaster. Both are true simultaneously, and that tension is exactly what makes this part of the story so frustrating to sit with. Some went back to Pontiac through the fleet agreement. Remember, these were loan vehicles from the start. Pontiac did not donate those cars to the production. They loaned them under a promotional arrangement, and when the cameras stopped rolling, the cars that were still functional went back to the manufacturer the same way a rental goes back to the lot. No flags on the file, no notation anywhere in the paperwork indicating that these particular vehicles had spent the summer becoming the most recognizable cars in America. No asterisk. No hold placed on the inventory. Just units returned, processed, and moved along. The people handling that paperwork were not film historians. They were fleet administrators doing their jobs. You cannot really blame them for that. Nobody told them to care. The stunt cars that took serious damage during filming were totaled out and sold off. Some went directly to junkyards. A few may have been parted out on the spot. The production had no legal obligation to preserve them, and no particular financial motivation to try. This was not negligence in any meaningful sense. This was 1977. Hollywood treated cars as consumables, the same way they treated costumes and set dressing and everything else that served its purpose and then stopped being useful. The idea that a movie car might one day be worth preserving as a cultural artifact was not a conversation anyone in the industry was having yet. That conversation was still about 20 years away. Here is where it gets genuinely painful if you care about any of this. The Trans Ams that left the Smokey production intact, the ones that weren't destroyed on camera and weren't sent back to Pontiac, those cars re-entered civilian life with nothing attached to them. No documentation, no chain of provenance, no paperwork connecting them to Universal Pictures or Hal Needham or Burt Reynolds or any frame of that film. A car that left a production lot in Georgia in the fall of 1977 looked to every subsequent owner exactly like any other used Trans Am of the same year, because externally it was. Think about what that actually means. A car with Burt Reynolds' hands on the wheel, a car that had been through one of the most culturally significant automotive productions of the decade, ended up on a used car lot somewhere in the South with a sticker price and a fill-up-the-tank policy. Second owner doesn't know. Third owner doesn't know. Fourth owner is using it to commute to work in 1984 and has no idea. By the time the Fast and the Furious made movie car collecting a serious mainstream hobby in the early 2000s, the trail on most of these cars had been stone cold for the better part of 2 decades. One confirmed stunt car was destroyed during filming, gone completely and permanently. That one we can account for. The others are considerably more complicated, and that is putting it generously. The Burt Reynolds connection. Now, let's talk about Burt Reynolds, because his personal relationship with this car and with these cars is its own separate and genuinely moving story. Reynolds loved the Trans Am, not in a celebrity who says he loves his prop way. He actually loved it. He talked about it in interviews for decades after the film. He drove Trans Ams personally. He understood what the car represented, not just to the film, but to a specific kind of American optimism that he spent his entire career embodying. Reynolds opened the Burt Reynolds and Friends Museum in Jupiter, Florida in 2001. For those who need the geography, Jupiter is on the Atlantic coast of South Florida, about an hour north of Miami. The museum housed memorabilia from his entire career, costumes, scripts, photographs, and cars. Multiple cars, including Trans Ams from the Smokey productions. And here I want to be careful because the documentation around exactly which cars were in that museum and their specific production provenance is complicated in ways that matter to collectors. Reynolds had accumulated Trans Ams over the years through various channels. Some were verified production vehicles, some were tribute builds, beautifully done, accurate to the film's specifications, but not the actual cars from the shoot. The museum displayed them without always making that distinction crystal clear, which created a secondary mythology problem that the collector market is still sorting out today. The museum itself closed in 2015. Reynolds, who was in his late 70s and dealing with financial pressures that had accumulated over several years, could not sustain it. The closure was not dramatic. It was just a door that stopped opening one day. And the contents of that museum, the cars, the memorabilia, the artifacts of one of the most remarkable careers in Hollywood history, needed somewhere to go. Reynolds passed away in September of 2018 at the age of 82. He had been through heart surgery, financial difficulties, and the particular loneliness of a man whose era had technically ended, even though he never quite accepted that. He was still working, still charming everyone in the room, still Burt. And about a year after he died, the collector world found out what he had actually kept. The auction and the reckoning. Julian's Auctions handled the Burt Reynolds estate sale in 2019, and if you follow the collector car market at all, you remember what happened. The auction drew international attention before a single lot crossed the block. Reynolds had been collecting his own memorabilia for decades, and the scope of what came out of that estate was genuinely staggering. Costumes, scripts, personal correspondence, firearms, furniture, and cars. Multiple cars, including Trans Ams. The headline lot for the car community was a 1977 Pontiac Trans Am Special Edition that came with documentation connecting it directly to the Smokey and the Bandit production. The bidding on that car was not polite. The collector community had waited decades for a documented production vehicle to surface with clean provenance, and when one finally did, the room responded accordingly. I want to be honest with you here because the documentation question genuinely matters, and I am not going to wave it away. The provenance on Reynolds' estate Trans Ams, like a lot of movie car provenance from this era, is supported by a combination of photographic evidence, production records, and Reynolds' own testimony about the cars he kept and why. That's actually more documentation than most movie cars from 1977 have. It's not a VIN traced through an unbroken chain of title going back to the Universal production lot. That kind of documentation essentially does not exist for cars from this era because nobody was thinking about it in 1977. What the auction confirmed is that Reynolds had kept Trans Ams from the production in his personal collection, that he regarded them as genuinely important, and that the collector market agreed. The prices reflected that agreement loudly and clearly. A verified production Trans Am from the estate sold for over $500,000. For context, a stock 1977 Trans Am in excellent condition sells for between $40,000 and $60,000 today. The Smokey Premium, backed by legitimate estate provenance, multiplied that value by roughly 10 times. That is what documentation does. That is why the cars that evaporated into the used vehicle market in 1977 represent a loss that is both cultural and financial, and unfortunately permanent. The survivors, where they are now. So, where are the surviving production vehicles right now? The ones we can actually account for. The estate auction car is in private hands. The buyer did not publicize their identity, which is completely standard for major collector acquisitions at this price level. It exists. It has documentation. It is almost certainly sitting in a climate-controlled space being very carefully looked after. That's the best possible outcome for a car like this, and I genuinely mean that. The Museums of Speed in Gainesville, Florida has displayed Trans Am material connected to the Reynolds legacy. The National Corvette Museum, despite the obvious brand focus, has hosted Pontiac Productions displays over the years as part of broader American muscle culture exhibitions. And then there are the private collections. At any given weekend car show in the Southeast United States, you will encounter a 1977 Trans Am Special Edition in black and gold, whose owner will tell you it was in the film. Some of them are telling the truth. Most of them are not because they're lying necessarily, but because the documentation that would prove it either doesn't exist or has been lost. The Smokey Trans Am became such a cultural icon that tribute builds flooded the market almost immediately after the film. By the early 1980s, there were so many accurate recreations in private hands that distinguishing a real production vehicle from a well-executed tribute without paperwork became essentially impossible. This is the same problem that plagues the Dukes of Hazzard Chargers, the Smokey tribute cars, and the General Lee replicas. When a film car becomes iconic enough, the culture replicates it obsessively, and when the replicas are good enough and the documentation on the originals is thin enough, the truth gets genuinely difficult to locate. The unsolved thread. Here is the thread that nobody has fully resolved, and I want to be straight with you about that, because I think you deserve the honest version. The primary hero car, the one that carried the most screen time, the one that Burt Reynolds drove personally through the majority of principal photography, has not been definitively, publicly, unambiguously verified to a specific chassis in a specific location with an unbroken documented chain of custody from the Universal production lot to the present day. The estate auction car has the strongest provenance of any Trans Am publicly associated with the production. Whether it is specifically the hero car is a question that the documentation supports but does not conclusively answer in the way that a VIN matched against production records from a manufacturer fleet log would answer it. Those records, if they exist, have not surfaced publicly. The manufacturer fleet logs from Pontiac's 1977 promotional loan program may be in a GM archive somewhere. They may have been discarded decades ago. Nobody has confirmed either. What this means practically is that somewhere, possibly in the private collection of someone who has no idea what they're actually sitting on, possibly in a garage in Georgia or Alabama or Florida, there may be a 1977 Trans Am that does not know it is the most important Trans Am ever built. And if it's been repainted, if the documentation was separated from the vehicle at any point in the last 47 years, we may never be able to confirm it. That possibility keeps certain people awake at night. I am one of those people. You're welcome. The 1977 Pontiac Trans Am from Smokey and the Bandit is not just a movie car. It is the reason Pontiac stayed in the performance business long enough to produce the cars that the next generation grew up worshiping. It is the reason black and gold became a visual shorthand for a very specific kind of American confidence. It is the reason Burt Reynolds, already the biggest star in the world, became something slightly larger than that, became a cultural symbol. And like most things that matter too much, the world didn't take very good care of it. Some cars were destroyed on camera, which is at least an honest ending. Some were returned to Pontiac and fed back into the used vehicle pipeline, which is the standard ending, the quiet, undignified one that most movie cars get. One ended up in a Florida museum that eventually couldn't sustain itself. One sold at a state auction for more than $500,000 and disappeared into private hands. And at least one, possibly the most important one, is still out there in the world, with no idea who it is. If you have a credible lead on a documented production Trans Am, drop it in the comments below. Not a tribute build, not a really nice black and gold special edition somebody told you was in the film. Actual documentation. A build sheet, a production photograph, a chain of title that traces back to Universal or Pontiac circa 1977. The comment section is wide open, and the community here takes this seriously. Hit the like button if this one landed differently than you expected. Subscribe to American Muscle if you want more stories like it. We track down the real history behind the cars that made you fall in love with cars in the first place. The Bandit always ran. Sometimes the car runs too. We'll see you in the next lane.